All right, welcome back, everybody. Today we're talking about value, which is a measure of light and dark. I'm going to be doing a drawing demo, but before I do that, I just wanted to talk about our reference image and talk about relative value, general value, and local value. There's a lot of terms, they all kind of sound like the same thing, so I just wanted to clear things up before we get started on the drawing, and we'll take a look at the value scale and how all these different values are relating to each other and how we can use that knowledge, try to understand it, and use our pencils to create form on our flat piece of paper. So, got my value scale here. If it's helpful to draw out a value scale on your paper, you're more than welcome to try that. Since this is kind of a review, it's an intermediate sketching class, we won't dedicate a whole class session to just drawing a value scale. And especially if you were in the class last semester, I assume you understand what these value steps mean. So it's still important to view the reference image or whatever it is that you're drawing in front of you through the value scale and how it relates to these different steps. What I want to focus on today and talk about right now is the context of these different values. It's not so much about matching each value perfectly. It's sort of like a paint by number thing, although we do want to get close enough. What we want to do is really understand the context of these values and how they relate to each other. So first we'll talk about relative value. Relative value, if we look really close here, is the relationship of two values in a specific isolated area. So we can let's look in the shadow first. Let's look in the shadow of this fabric up here. Here's the edge of the shadow shape. We have a cast shadow edge along here. This is the form shadow edge along the form of the fabric as it turns away from the light source. Comes down here and gets picked up again with another cast shadow edge through here. Inside of here there's a darker shadow. So when we draw this later, we'll start off with just like the general shadow shape, and then once we have a good like map of our shadows established, we'll go in and make this a bit darker. What's important here is the relative value versus the general value. Relative value is about the context of these values to each other in this one area. So here we have the light of the fabric, the general shadow shape, we can call it just like the general shadow color, and we can call this like the pitch shadow or like the darkest dark. Three different values. This one is the brightest in the context of this setup, and this is the darkest right here. This is kind of acting more like a midtone, the larger shadow shape right here. What I want to do is show you the general value, or the relative value versus the general value. So in this specific area, this relative area, the way these relate to each other, this is going to be the brightest value. So I'm just going to take from here. Let's say this is pretty close. Maybe I can make this a little bit brighter. There's some texture on the fabric, so it's hard to get it perfect. But if we say this is the value of the light shape, when we hold it up to these shadows right here, it looks very bright, right? This is a light shape. It looks like a light midtone, maybe even brighter. Especially as I pull it closer to these shadows in here, it seems really, really bright. So we can pull this over here for now. I'll make another one just for the average shadow right here. So as this relates to this light shape right here, this seems really, really dark. But if I pull this over here, I can make it even smaller. When I hold this up to this pitch shadow, the darkest dark in here, it actually seems kind of light, or at least we can say it's less dark. So what I want to do now is take both of these. So this is our general shadow, or I'll call it the average shadow value for the fabric, and this is the average light value for the fabric. If we take both of these and bring them over here, When we put them on the white sphere, which is on the lighter side in general, they both appear pretty dark. This looks like a midtone, and this looks like a very dark midtone. So the lightest value in the fabric is really a midtone. So going back to our value scale, where's the fabric? It's probably somewhere in here, right around in the middle. So yeah, we'll call that a midtone. This is a darker midtone, somewhere down here, closer to black. So just in the language that we're using, just so we're all on the same page, the relationship between these two in the context, the difference between the general value and the relative value is really just talking about the context that you're seeing them in. So let's say you're drawing and you're in here, the relative difference here between these two values is that this is brighter than this, and this is still brighter than this third one over here, which is our darkest dark, closer to black. The relationship between these values in this relative context is, you can see that here. The general value refers to these as it relates to the context of this whole picture. So especially if we hold these up to the light background here, you'll see that they're both, all three are on like the lower end of the value scale. So the general value puts these into context in the whole value spectrum. Local value is just kind of like, it's like putting the blinders on and just looking at a specific area of your drawing. It's important to always step back far away from your drawing so you can keep track of both. If you're able to understand both simultaneously, understand that this midtone is brighter than this dark midtone, but still darker than this light shape over here. Having both of those understood, both concepts, is going to help you understand all these values and how they relate to the larger value scale. So I have this value scale in the module as well. You can see here where the three dots are the same for every step. There's white, midtone, and black. So we don't see the black one in the context of the black. We could say it's like the relative context of the black value here. Same thing in the midtone. It goes away, it vanishes up against the other midtones. Even right here, this same color appears as a light in the context of this dark midtone, and here it appears as a dark in the context of the lighter midtone. I hope that makes sense. Let me know if it doesn't. One more thing I want to talk about is local value. Local value can be confusing, but it refers to the value of something regardless of what the light source is doing. So in this case, the local value of the fabric is darker than the local value of the sphere. All that means is that it's a darker color. So the example I gave in the module is, if you think of a piece of coal and a piece of snow, the snow is brighter than the coal just by the color that it is, whether it's in the light or in shadow. So if you're holding a piece of coal and a piece of snow on a bright sunny day or in the middle of the night, either way, the snow is going to be brighter than the coal. Another example is a school bus versus a fire truck. The fire truck, the red of the fire truck is just intrinsically darker than the yellow school bus. So if we look at this in color, it can be harder to detect with the color, and you're gonna, when you're drawing, especially from direct observation and not a black and white photo, it's important to learn to see those values. It can be trickier, it's deceiving, because like this, it's such a rich color where the fabric's getting hit with light here. We're gonna think, okay, this is really bright, and then this is also really bright. If anything, the contrast of light and dark is making this look brighter. You might just as a guess, you might say this is actually going to be brighter. But when we look at it in black and white, and especially with what we demonstrated earlier with these three values over here, this midtone, the light, where the light is hitting the fabric, we could think of this as the local color. It's usually if you have distinct light and shadow shapes like this, you'll best find the local color right before the line of the core shadow. So let's take a sample of this color right here. And I don't expect everyone to have their own version of Photoshop here and do this every time you make a drawing. I'm just doing this to try and help you understand. Okay, it's pretty much the same. But yeah, we take it from right here. It's basically a midtone up against the white of the sphere. So one way to find this, if you're out in the wild doing a drawing, you're trying to understand the values that you're seeing, I think the best way to do it is ask yourself, what is the lightest light here? You may not see anything that's actually truly white. I always tell students that the white in the value scale is like staring into the sun through a telescope, which I don't recommend. You can't do that. You're going to hurt your eyes. But that it's like the brightest thing you can imagine. Similarly, dark black is like closing your eyes in the middle of the night in a really dark place. It's so dark we rarely come into contact with it in a natural setting during the day. So just knowing that, just to kind of help bracket your values, still look for the lightest light and try and understand where that is. I'm going to say it's somewhere around here near the sphere, where the sphere is closest to the light source, which we can imagine from the direction of the cast shadows is somewhere directly above up here. It's a light bulb, pretty much directly above the sphere. So the brightest bright is somewhere around here. So we can take a sample of that. We can compare the lightest light to everything else around it. So even though this looks really bright over here, it's not going to be quite as bright as the sphere. I know it's not always, again, it's not always an option to just move things around in Photoshop, but that is how I look at things if I'm trying to understand the value of something subtle like this. A really bright piece of fabric, this like dark yellow orange color, is actually darker than the sphere. Similarly, look for the darkest dark. Probably somewhere in here, I'm gonna guess. There's no light coming in here. Even through here, it's brighter where the fabric is touching the ground plane here. There's light reflecting up from the white ground plane up into this fabric. Maybe the light's coming through as well, kind of giving it that glow. When we look at that in black and white, you can see that this here is going to be darker than this other darkest dark, whoops, over here. See it? So the relative value here, this is brighter than this, even though this is still very dark. Actually, it's not. It looks a little bit lighter than our average shadow in the fabric. But you're going to find that a lot. These values are really created out of context. This looks so dark right here. I thought it was darker than it was because it's next to this white ground plane. That's one of the brightest values in the whole picture. And then at the same time, we can use that to frame our values. If something is really bright, and we want to make it seem even brighter, we can kind of leave the photo behind and start to manipulate it to make it look brighter than it is. To do that, we make the thing next to it a little bit darker. Inversely, if we want to make something look darker and we've pushed the pencil to its limit, let's say you're using like an HB graphite pencil, you may not have the option to get too much darker other than like a pretty dark gray. So to make it darker, you make the thing next to it as bright as you can possibly make it. With drawing, it's tricky because just the limits of what the paper can take and how much your eraser is going to like lift the graphite off the page if you've already gone pretty dark. But it just that frame of mind, that attitude of looking at it in the context of its surroundings is going to help you design your picture. I can show that more when we start drawing. But yeah, I wanted to share that all with you. Local value, relative value, and the general value. It's all about context. Whether we're viewing it and trying to understand it, or if we're manipulating what we're seeing in our drawing and changing it to serve the design of our composition, the better we understand it, the more we can turn the dials. So I'm going to be using graphite for this drawing. I have HB here along with 2B and 4B, and I have them sharpened already. There's that video from a few weeks back on sharpening. If you need help with that, make sure they're sanded down so you can use that edge of the tip of the pencil. I also have 6B and 8B, which we'll get to later on in the drawing. So we'll have a range of values within our pencils. If you're using just a regular HB pencil, that's fine too. You can take this drawing pretty far with just the one pencil. And if you're using charcoal, all the same principles apply. We're just going to make sure we're going to start off really super light, using straight line construction lines to lay this drawing out. And I'm speeding up this demo video so it's not too long. I'm focusing on the sphere, paying attention where the top and bottom as well as the left and right side are and how that relates to the outside frame of the edge of the paper that I've taped off here. This image is proportional to 9 by 11 inches. So if you have a 9 by 12 piece of paper, that might be close enough, but if you want to be extra exact with it, you can just tape off 1 inch from either the top or the bottom, or you can tape off the whole page and measure like I did here. I'm using the Strathmore drawing paper. I think it's 11 by 14, so that with the tape it comes out to about 9 by 11, I think. I'm just using really light lines, all pretty consistently light and soft. I know I talked a lot about line weight last week and how much you can vary your lines. This drawing we're going to spend more time on it, so just anticipating the time I'm going to spend and the mistakes I might make in laying things out, I'm going to move really slowly and draw really lightly. With all those subtle curves in the fabric, you can see I'm using straight lines just to keep things simple. A straight line is always going to be easier and simpler to understand than a curved line. And as I develop the drawing, the lines will get more and more complex, which will open them up to be have more of those subtle curves that we see there. But I'm going to build up to that. I'm not just going to go for it from the start. One thing I do want to be aware of is the gesture of the way the fabric moves. I know I've said this a lot in class before, but I'll keep saying it. The movement we're after in a drawing isn't that the drawing itself is moving or the objects we're trying to draw are moving. The thing that moves through a drawing is our line of sight and our vision. So as you get to know the composition and the way all the pieces fit together, pay attention to how your own eyes move through the image. And that'll tell you a lot about the movement. So you can see the shapes I'm putting in here are already implying just a little bit of flow down towards the sphere and back up towards the top and side edge of the picture plane. I'm using these light and shadow shapes to kind of move us in those different directions. I'm trying to simplify where the light is, or what the light is hitting in the fabric and the sphere, in the background and the ground plane. And I'm drawing in boundaries for where the shadow shape begins and ends. So I'm not worried about individual values yet. We're going to spend plenty of time here just setting this drawing up before we start looking at individual values. Right now I'm just focusing on a larger light shape versus a larger shadow shape. You can see I'm starting to fill in the general shadows now that I've mapped them out. Again, spend as much time as you need laying things out here and blocking them in. If you spend most of your time just trying to get things to land in the right place, that's good. That's the hardest part of drawing, is just getting things to be the right size and shape and in the right place. I'm speeding it all up here so we can spend the time talking about values, but there aren't really any shortcuts to that. I'm holding my pencil at the very end, trying to draw with my arm and my shoulder more than my hand and my wrist. We don't want to grip the pencil down near the point because it's going to be really hard to move it around over larger areas. Holding it towards the back like that makes it feel more like a paintbrush. Speaking of brushes, I'm going to use this big paintbrush. It's a totally dry and soft brush. I'm just using it to move the graphite around. Any paintbrush that you have around the house, even if it's like a big house painting brush, as long as it's clean and dry, it's a really efficient way to move the graphite around the paper, and it's just going to give you a really soft and even tone. You can see how light the lines and shapes are from that first pass. And I'm going in a little darker now, a little bit more sure of where things are going to land. With each pass that I make, I get a little bit more certain about where things are going, but I'm never totally trusting or locked in with those until the very end of the drawing. Starting to pay attention to the edges of the light shapes and the shadow shapes. Here's a sharp edge at the end of the fabric there. The cast shadows are going to have more of a firm edge, and the form shadows are going to have a soft edge. Those abrupt plane changes where those pieces of fabric come to an end or where the fabric meets the sphere, those edges will be sharp. But even in those spots, I'm still downplaying all of the sharpness and the certainty. We want to start off general, soft, and light, and then slowly make the drawing more specific, sharper, and darker. It's harder to take a complex thing and make it simple, and it's going to be harder to make a sharper edge softer, and it's also really hard to make a dark shape light again. So we do have a trajectory here, like an overarching theme of light to dark, general to specific, and soft to sharp. These shadows where the fabric meets the ground plane, there's really sharp edged cast shadows. That's because the object casting the shadow, in this case it's the fabric, is really close to the ground plane, or the object that the shadow is being cast onto. You'll notice the cast shadow from the sphere onto the fabric has softer edges. That's because the edges of the sphere are further away from the fabric. So the proximity of the object casting the shadow to the object that the shadow is being casted onto, that'll dictate how sharp or soft those edges are. If you've ever stood on the beach during the sunset and your shadow is stretched out behind you, you'll notice that your shadow closest to your feet, where your feet are really close to the ground or even touching the ground, the cast shadow is really sharp there, but up towards the top of your head, as your shadow is further and further away from you, that edge is going to be really soft. It's how close that object is to that ground plane. That's going to tell you how soft or sharp the edge of the shadow is. The closer it is to the object, the sharper it's going to be. And you can see that in the fabric too. Form shadows followed by cast shadows, followed by more form shadows. Those cast shadows, the edges can be sharp into like more firm edges, into softer edges of the form shadow. It all depends on where the light source is coming from and how that shapes those shadows on the fabric itself. So I think I'm using the 2B pencil here, starting to get a little bit darker. I'm just going around filling in those shadows again. Pretty much the same pattern as that first pass, just darkening everything. But still, if you think about that value scale we looked at earlier, it's still a very light midtone compared to just the white of the paper. So we're into that like second or maybe third step on the value scale. And if we think about general values versus relative values, the general values, like the true value that we see in the photo, we won't get there till the end of the drawing. But the relative value relationships should all be established in the first or second pass here. You can see I'm putting in these darker shadows within the shadow shape. So those relationships are understood and they're clear, even though I haven't really pulled the trigger on darkening everything. We want to slowly make our way to that. You can see this big chunk of fabric has this big overarching, or we could say underlying bend down away from the light, giving it a really slow gradient with faster, smaller gradients on top of it. It always reminds me of the surface of the ocean. If you think about what the ocean looks like on a choppy, windy day, there's really big waves that have medium-sized waves on top of them, which have even smaller waves on top of those, and they're all self-similar all the way down. So as you look at this fabric, think about the big overarching forms, how it kind of slopes down and then comes out towards us underneath the sphere. And then there's smaller events going from light to dark on top of those. This cast shadow here getting warped by that bump in the fabric. It's a really interesting detail I want to pay really close attention to, getting that shape right, and the values and the edges. So this might be the 4B pencil. With each pass, I get a little bit darker. As I change the pencils, going from each one getting darker, I want to make sure I'm never pushing the pencil too hard. You might be able to get a similar value out of pushing a 2B pencil really hard versus using a 6B pencil really lightly. But if you have the different pencils, if you have these like more complex tools, make sure you're always using them really, really lightly. The harder you push a pencil, the more difficult it's going to be to erase it. You might even like gouge a little hole in the paper. If you're just using the one pencil, try and be as subtle as you can with the light marks and just take your time building up to the darker marks. So I'm starting to go in a little bit sharper again, trying to bring definition to all of these shapes and how they interact. I'm paying more attention to the quality of the edge than the exact value. I'm not trying to match the value just yet. Remember, I'm thinking about the relationships of the darks within the darks or the light shapes within the light shapes, and especially how they meet up. So here's a softer edged form shadow compared to the sharper edged cast shadow above it. I'm also trying to use the shadows behind the sphere to define the sphere itself. You'll notice I haven't really outlined the sphere as like a really clean circle. Since the sphere is three-dimensional, the form's turning away from us, I don't want to be too harsh and too linear about defining the boundary of that sphere. That's not a rule, but challenge yourself with trying to show the boundaries between these objects by just using tone, like the changes in value, rather than the lines we used last week. Not that we want to get rid of that linear way of thinking. We're going to hold on to that and what we learned last week, but we're putting it on hold for a little bit just to focus on creating form with these tonal shifts. So I'm using the brush again, just following a similar pattern of spreading that graphite around in a smooth and even way, and then going back in with the pencil to redefine those shadows and push them a little bit darker each time. Using the 6B pencil here. One step darker than the 4B. So pay attention to the spectrum of values within the shadows here. We're starting to get more specific about light and dark. There's this pit shadow in that top left corner. That's one of the darkest values in the picture. And then these shapes over here have some reflected light in them. So light is reflecting from the light shape of the fabric itself up into that shadow. So that top plane of the shadow in that fold is lighter than the bottom one. That's because of the reflected light. So pay attention to those subtle little shifts and pay attention to the edges of the shadow where it's softer or sharper. Whether it's a form shadow or a cast shadow. Remember, form shadows tend to be softer. Cast shadows tend to be a little bit sharper. Can feel a little bit tedious to fill in a big area like this with just a simple tone, so using the side of the point of the pencil can be really helpful, and especially using a brush. It can just do it more efficiently and a lot cleaner. I don't recommend smudging the paper with your finger. Since there's oil in your skin, that oil will get embedded in the paper and just make whatever graphite is already down there pretty permanent. So it might look good in the moment, but it's not going to erase too well. Since the brush is so dry, it moves the graphite around freely. The value shifts in the sphere itself are very, very subtle. That line of the core shadow and the form shadow, in the grand context, in the context of the whole picture, or again what we call the general value, it's not that dark. It's really like a mid-tone or a light mid-tone, and then there's reflected light after that form shadow. The real darkness in the whole sphere area is underneath the sphere, where it's meeting that fabric is where it actually gets really dark. On the sphere itself, the value of that form shadow might be lighter, or at least of a similar value as the light shape of the fabric. I know it sounds confusing, but I'll say it again. The value of the shadow, the form shadow on the sphere, is a pretty similar value to the light hitting the fabric because of the difference in the local value. The color of the fabric is just darker than the sphere. Just starting to use the eraser a little bit on the fabric, since I know, like I just mentioned, the light on the fabric is still darker than most, if not all, of the sphere, but I think using the brush, it's getting to a place where I can really start to get specific about the actual values of everything. So I'm just using the eraser to pull up a little bit of graphite where that light hits the fabric, and to make sure those edges are really clean and organized. When I say organized, I mean that I'm getting really specific about where a shadow shape ends and a light shape begins, especially in this area right here. That form shadow bends around into a cast shadow and bends around again into another form shadow. It's a really interesting area. I think it creates a lot of movement and flow in the composition, so I want to be specific about where one thing ends and another begins. Other areas I could be pretty vague. All of it's pretty subjective, but I think this area is really interesting and fun to look at, so spending a lot of time there and I'm being really specific about it. And in this stage of the drawing, we're about 3/4 of the way through. This is the time to start paying attention to what you notice and what you keep coming back to and what you find meaningful. Remember to keep stepping back and looking at your drawing from far away. That's one thing you can't really see in this video that I do pretty frequently. It's easy to get caught up in the details. So I'm constantly trying to step back and look at the big picture and make any big changes, big but subtle and almost kind of invisible changes. I was just laying down a lot of tone over a large area. If you feel like a whole section of your drawing has to get darker, like mine does to the right of the sphere, it's worth putting that time in. Might feel less rewarding in the short term because it's not like a fun, crispy little detail, but it's really important. It's going to really help make the foundation of your drawing more solid. Here I'm just pushing that connection between the sphere and the fabric to try and get it as dark as it needs to be. So I'm reaching that point in my drawing where I want to start getting specific and sharper. If you feel comfortable in your drawing with where everything's at, you could start looking at those little details that I encourage everyone to ignore in the beginning stage. Might be a specific little transition from light to dark. It might be the end or edge of an object. You may even depart from the photo reference a little bit. The closer I get to the finish line here, the less and less I'm actually looking at the photo, and I'm mostly looking at my drawing. I've passed through it enough times to know, pretty much understand what's happening with the light and the fabric and the sphere. So I'm picking and choosing what I think is meaningful and important and focusing on those things, and things that I'm not that into, I'm ignoring, whether it's conscious or not. That is a skill in itself that you'll just continue to develop over time, and that's how your own genuine voice will emerge through your drawings, is by paying attention to what's important and leaving out what's not. I always get questions from students, how do you decide that? And it's really up to you. In this class, I can tell you what to focus on, what to pay attention to, but in the end, that's all completely up to you. For me, I focus on what's driving the composition, what's driving the movement, and what makes the relationships between each element really shine. I try and pay attention to the relationships between these things more than the objects themselves. So how the fabric relates to the sphere, how the light relates to the shadows, how the positive space relates to the negative space. For me, those are all elements in their own right, just as much as the sphere and the fabric are things worth looking at. It always comes back to like an orchestration of relationships. Part of what happens here when we start to sharpen things up and make the dark things darker, the darkest darker, we're increasing contrast, whether it's contrast in value or contrast in the edges of the transitions from light to dark. By making things darker and sharper and increasing contrast, that's going to draw in the eye of the viewer. So wherever you end up putting this contrast is really saying to the viewer of the drawing, hey, look over here, look at this thing. So you want to be conscious of that when you're creating contrast, when you're pushing those details to be extra sharp. These shapes here in the foreground of the fabric hitting the ground plane, I could sharpen them up even more and really bring them into focus, but the drawing is not really about those. So again, whether it's conscious or not, what you think is important is what's going to come into focus. If you are conscious of it, you'll have more control over it, I think. And remember, if you want to make something look lighter, but you can't erase it anymore, you can't make it any brighter, make the thing next to it darker. Secret weapon. Especially at this stage in the drawing. I'm starting to use this black Conte pencil, which is like it's the darkest pencil I have. It doesn't grip onto the graphite that great, so I don't recommend using it a whole lot, but I can use it sparingly, just like punching up a couple little edges here and there. Pushing it just a little bit darker can just give it a little bit more depth, make it feel a little bit more real. I definitely don't want to overdo it here, but I feel like I'm reaching the limit of the graphite. I mentioned it earlier, but I personally think graphite has more, you get more control in the subtlety of the really light values, but you miss out on some of the darker ones. And then charcoal and that Conte pencil is the opposite of that. You can really push the dark tones and get a lot of really deep, beautiful, dark values out of it. But the super light values can be a little bit hard to control. So pay attention to your light source. Think about relative value versus the general value. Pay attention to the lightest light and the darkest dark and how that can give context to the value you happen to be drawing in that moment. And have fun with this. Take your time and relax. I'll talk to you all next week.